Good evening. This evening I want to talk about the workplace um, and my resume and um, and the differences in lifestyle and self-expression. Is how the internet changed everything and how everything changed after my main career ended and how I felt about my own place in the world, how that changed with respect to work and my own content. But so I'm bringing up on my John W. Bushka's site has both all my writings, some archived, except what's on the blog, and what's on my YouTube video channel. But it also has my old resume. Once in a while I get questions about it on LinkedIn and so forth. I really am not in the old job market, but I wanted to go over it a little bit just to show you a few things. My military service was started in 1968 when I was drafted, as I've gone over in previous videos, and I was actually I had an MOS 01E20. I was actually a mathematician, data analyst, and I had jobs. A summer job programming, learning Fortran programming at David Taylor Model Basin already, and had done some programming at the University of Kansas as well, teaching math. I've gone over that. When I got out of the Army in 1970, my first job was what we called an operations research trainee. And at the time, they really courted people when they were getting out of the Army if they had advanced degrees. They paid for all the interview expenses and the rental cars and the hotels and everything, and the moving expenses. And for a year, I was supposed to be on several separate assignments. The most important one was in India, even though the job was in Princeton, New Jersey, was in Indianapolis at a plant, and I was supposed to develop a recursive model in Fortran for optimizing production lines, and it ran recursively and it didn't run very well on their computer. I can't say that this was particularly a success, and there were other problems. I was actually laid off at the end of a year, which was the only layoff I had until 2001. But I was fortunate that a chess player, good friend of mine, who I actually usually beat, I knew at the Navy Department, and he helped me get a job very quickly in Washington at the Naval Command System Support Activity, and that was Fortran programming for missile defense, and actually to help prepare for the SALT talks with the Soviet Union, and a little bit of assembler. And then, because partly of some personal circumstances and partly concern over a top secret clearance, I decided to leave and go to private industry, and I worked for UNIVAC in excuse me, worked for UNIVAC in Morristown and then Piscataway, New Jersey, in site support. A lot of it at public service, electric and gas. I just did little things, and also worked on benchmarks. Didn't really started traveling to Minnesota a lot, to Eagan, but still wasn't really responsible for anything until I finally decided, when I came out the second time, decided I needed to move into New York City. And the personal aspect of that I'm going to talk about in a later video later this month. But I worked for the National Broadcasting Company, for NBC, on their general ledger system with a package, but I also learned COBOL programming a lot there. Also did an interface program on the old RCA Spectra again. I had very bad programming habits at first, but this was by 1976 we had the new general ledger system in production, and this was the first time I had responsibility for something that ran in production, and had to learn how to be careful with production files and sign on and so forth. There were some incidents there, but I had to, get through what it really meant to be responsible for that. Also, we had a strike. There was a strike against NBC by the NABIT, the camera workers, the union. And we actually did strike duty and got paid for it since we weren't part of a union. And that was the first time I worked on the set for Somerset, which is no longer a soap opera, no longer on television. But that was the first time I began to imagine what would happen if something I wrote got on television or the movies. That was the first hint. But in order to get IBM, because IBM monopolized the mainframe job market so much as the other Univac and GE and some other ones sort of fell away. I took the opportunity to jump and go to Bradford National Corporation in New York. I think there's a picture. There's a picture of the building I worked in Lower Manhattan. I also worked in Midtown later, and there's a picture of the cast iron building that I lived in. And actually, there's a picture. I've got a picture of the RCA building too, right here where I'd worked in before. But when this again, we successfully put into production a management and reporting system called MARS. There was also a statistical system called SIRS. And again, I was responsible for the end of month, this job actually went very, very well. It was the best job experience I'd had. But I decided to move to Dallas to get away from a personal situation, which I'll discuss in a later video. This is sort of a little story circle in itself. But I moved to Dallas and went to experience a little bit different lifestyle, and actually the gay community there was just as viable as it was anywhere else. But that's another story. But I worked for the combined Medicare A and B consortium, which was a group of 7 Blue Cross and Blue Shield plans, which wanted to develop a combined Medicare system to compete with EDS. And everybody knows electronic data systems. H. Ross Perot's company was the big villain in those days. But the project failed because they could never get the plans to agree on what the requirements were. And that's people who worked with me in that experience might find this video, and they're going to remember this and chuckle. There was a lot of blame to go around for why that failed, and anybody who remembers then is going to agree with that as to what happened. But basically, they were too set in their ways and too rigid in the way they thought. They needed to allow users to have more control of what was going to go on than they were willing to for political reasons. But I left before the axe fell, before the project was canned, and went to Chilton Corporation in September or November of 1981. And I went into new systems development. For 3 years, we designed a new billing system. With COBOL, not an assembler like the other one, DOS assembler, with COBOL and Datacom DB and DC. And it was AMDOL, which was an IBM MVS emulator, but it wasn't IBM's IMS and CICS, which is what you really wanted to have on your resume if possible. But I was there for 6 years, and then started in 1985, we started to implement everything. About that time, I bought the condo that I would live in Dallas for the last 3.5 years there. There was kind of the front of it. Again, a very interesting time in my life. We didn't implement anything until about September 1985. A lot of it was consolidating bills according to customers, sort of clientizing the customers and consolidating their bills. That was what a lot of it was about. And then streaming down the billing cycle and making it more efficient, and converting it from DOS to OS and all kinds of stuff like that. I actually was on call the day my father died for the implementation, which was New Year's Day in 1986. Being on call became, once I started implementing, for the rest of my IT career from September in '85 until the end of 2001, I was always responsible for something that was in production. So I was always valuable in the sense we weren't just sitting around designing things. For about 7 years, I didn't really do a whole lot, but attend to my personal life. But I had to be responsible and be on call, which I wasn't usually paid for. It was usually out of my own pocket. There was no unioning or anything like that. But when TRW bought Chilton in 1987, and I left in June of '88. I might have been able to stay until they shut down in January of 1990 and wound up in the same place, but I decided not to take a chance of becoming less employable. And I went back to work for a Blue Cross and Blue Shield outfit of Virginia, which wasn't one of the other plans, and called the Consolidated Consulting Group, and it got bought by Lewin. But I stayed with the team, and I kind of saved the company by figuring out one problem with why the results did in the Medicare the prospective payment system for Medicare revenue report simulation. Why that didn't come out the way ProPac said it was supposed to. I solved that because they didn't actually follow what the Federal Register said they were supposed to do. Kind of saved the company in January of '89. Then we got bought, and then when I got bought, I actually brought all the tapes and records up in my own car to the new location myself in May of 1989. So that's kind of small business responsibility. And then the last major employer I had would be, would start out as USLICO, United Services Life, which serves the military, as I explained in another video. And that would get bought by Reliostar in Minneapolis, NWNL Reliostar, and then that would get bought by ING. And after the layoff at the end of 2001, in a couple more years, it'd be spun off in the United States as Voya. But one of the things, again, the projects I worked on, it was billing, and it was the way billing was consolidated and printed and grouped and so forth and sent to, particularly salary deduction billing. And so what would tend to happen, I would be an individual contributor, and I want to find something here that I really didn't. Just want to bring up this work values chart that I want to show you also. Some points I want to cover. One of the things I found out, that you would have to be responsible for very minute things in a relatively small number of systems or parts of the project, and my life was still a double life. My personal life, which was actually very rich for this pre-internet time. I'm starting to, write my book by this time. A lot of things that happened personally, and I had my classical music background and played in chess tournaments, and I had been very effective living in Dallas, helping them mitigate the AIDS crisis. In fact, I wrote a pamphlet with a doctor. It was one of the first things I wrote and had published in 1983 on how to cope with the epidemic. We published a pamphlet that we sent through the Dallas Gay Alliance and the gay community and everything. So that was one of the first things I ever published. That was well before the internet, with my doctor approving it. But there's kind of a lesson in all this. This was the last job I would have. I would be with this whole complex of companies for 12 years. But one of the things that it made several points. First of all, there are different kinds of employment. There's salaried, versus hourly when you get paid overtime, salary doesn't. And hourly you're more likely to have a union. And there's entrepreneurship, and that's where you own your own brand like I have with my books. And then, but a lot of entrepreneurship is franchise brands like retail, particularly fast food and restaurants and hotels and so forth, where you don't own the brand name. Something about mainframe computing culture. It was generally a good thing for an introvert like me, because sort of a lone wolf like me, because you could work on testing something yourself. You didn't have to work a lot with others. We said we did, but actually you worked alone mostly. And you had your own extra life. You tested and tested I got very good at imagining the slightest problems, which is one reason why I'm very analytical about problems today, like how you analyze gender theory, for example, and the dangers of what's being done to kids now and so forth. I'll ask questions and not go along with the politically correct belief of others, which to make other people feel more comfortable when reality doesn't really consult with what they want. But that's another discussion. When you work for somebody else, you don't own your own content. If you're laid off, in my case, in December 13th, 2001, I was cut off from having access to it. But when you do own your own content and are too generous with it, don't actually have a business in order to distribute it, don't have some way of selling and meeting other people's needs, real needs or imagined needs, but eventually you will get criticized anyway, and you might not be allowed to continue, which and why I trimmed down at the start of 2022. Again, is something I'll talk about in September. But yeah, the whole problem with what writers, again, is do you give up your own agency if you write for what other people want, like children's books or faith books or how-to books, or how to, if you're a parent, how to adjust to a gay or trans child or something like that. Or if you simply analyze on your own a difficult issue, and I did this with gays in the military because of the issue of forced intimacy and confined spaces. And that was the kind of thing that took a very focused analysis, and my approach was effective politically. But it's not real effective with most issues. Then the other question is, can techies sell? It's mostly a matter of customer service. Even people that have music backgrounds, for example, wind up managing people selling, doing telemarketing particularly when I worked for arts marketing for a little while for the National Symphony here in Washington after I came back. And I also worked for the Minnesota Orchestra a little bit, and I also worked as a debt collector for a couple months in Minnesota before I came back. That was interesting. But I didn't take up the challenge to sell insurance for Humana or New York Life, because I didn't want to be the person to pester people to call to sell things to them and have them thinking I was taking care of them because I was their insurance salesman or something. Later on, the issue I was maybe being a tax preparer. That was a little better. And there was also an issue when I was substitute teaching. We'll talk about a little bit more. But the main thing is, again, you own your own content when you're independent online, like I've been. You own it less if you have to work with other people, which most people have to do. And you generally don't have any rights to it at all if you're just working for somebody else. And I do thank you for listening.